I am super excited to introduce Marci Harris today to speak to us about her work at PopVox. I've wanted to have Marci come speak with us ever since the Connected Communities Initiative was the Data and Democracy Initiative, which was a few years ago. But we're really pleased to have Marci with us. She's co-founder and CEO of PopVox, which is a neutral, nonpartisan platform for legislative information and civic engagement. Before PopVox, Marci was tax, trade, and health counsel to Congressman Pete Stark and a member of the Ways and Means Health Subcommittee team for the Affordable Care Act. She holds a BA in International Relations and a JD from University of Memphis, an LLM from the American University Washington College of Law. She was an inaugural Technology and Democracy Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government's Ash Center in 2016 and a 2017 New America California Fellow. So please join me in welcoming Marci Harris.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much, Camille, Citrus. I asked to have this as more of a conversation because as I realized as I was starting to prepare that the topic is something that I have way more questions about than I have answers. So as you will have seen, the topic that I proposed for today was less about PopVox itself and more about thinking, what does democracy look like in this century? And you know, that's a pretty grandiose topic, and not one I suggested again because I think I've got it figured out, but because it's really, really, really weighing on my mind and I think the mind of a lot of people right now. The interesting thing in the context of the 21st century writ large is that we actually know what at least about 18% of it looks like already. We're there, we're in process. As we look back over the past 17 years since the year 2000, obviously there's some big moments that pop up. September 11th, the financial crisis, even technologically, the founding of Twitter, the founding of Facebook in 2000, I think it was 6. Google came in 1998. When you think about how much our world has changed even just in that short amount of time, it's stunning. Right now, where we sit, we feel a lot of discord. There's a lot in our society that I think we're questioning. It's almost like we're in that postmodern deconstruction phase. I was telling someone it feels like all the Legos are spread out all over the floor right now. And one of the big questions is how we're going to put everything back together. What the rest of the 21st century is going to look like, what the rest of the 80% of this century will look like. So the reason that I'm thinking about this so much is, as Camille stated, a few years ago, I and some co-founders got together to build a civic tech platform called PopVox, Voice of the People, Vox Populi. And that grew out of my experience as the congressional staffer. I was so frustrated back then with the way that information came into Congress. It was like we were being bombarded with emails and social media messages and even handwritten letters. And so the goal behind PopVox was, let's take this existing system and put it online, digitize it, give it transparency. That will reduce barriers to entry. That will help more people participate. We'll be crowdsourcing this. This will give Congress better information. And obviously, a greater democracy will result. So we solved the technical problem. Now, if you go to PopVox, you can find all the bills that are pending in Congress and now a state government as well. You can create a profile. You can write to your lawmaker. You can see what others are saying. we deliver the message, and technically it all works great. And what I realized as a staffer was that the input from constituents really means a lot to lawmakers. And they're now, through our system, they can receive that and know that it's coming from a real constituent. But with us and with a lot of folks who are working in this kind of, I would call it civic tech 1.0 time, there was such hope and idealism about what lowering barriers to entry and transparency would bring. What we didn't realize is the counter effect that was coming in the form of an ongoing decrease in education in general and civic education specifically, manipulation of social media and news and the messages that the general public was receiving, so that just simply creating a platform for more voices to be heard did not, I think everyone would agree, necessarily result in net positive overall. We've got a long way to go on this piece. So I just want to lay that out right now kind of as the beginning point for a discussion of where we go from here, because I think humility in the place that we find ourselves now is important, not just for civic tech projects, but for tech projects overall. I think you're hearing some of that now. I hope we're going to hear a whole lot more of it. But the great idealism that many of these projects, whether it is Twitter or Facebook or others, were undertaken with, I think are meeting some tough realities. One of those impacts that I want to talk about that I think we're only starting to realize the actual impact of is the decline of local media over the past 10 years. There's a stunning chart that shows the absolute fall off in revenue for newspapers since, I think, 2002. It's about $65 million a year that came out of newspaper revenues and is now going to digital ads, primarily to Google and Facebook. And what I think is important to understand in that change is not that technology disrupts old industries. We know that, and that's okay. We kind of accept that and even embrace it, especially out here. But what was lost in the disappearance of many local newspapers and local journalists that were employed by those newspapers were the folks sitting in the city council meeting listening to the issues that were popping up at a local level, was the explanation of that to the general public, and was the translation of civic and political issues that are maybe taking place at a national or state level to the general population. So that what replaced that, for the most part, was either 24/7 cable news, focused primarily on national politics and especially the horse race. Social media, of course, which we're all familiar with all of its filter bubbles and clickbaiting and sometimes false headlines and news. And then also studies are showing that even with the aggregation of local newspapers, when the local newspapers get bought up by a bigger newspaper, what suffers and what disappears is the coverage of the day-to-day civics, and it gets replaced by more crime statistics and the kinds of stories that are easily replicable or easily replicated from one paper to the next. It's easy to get a crime report and turn that into a story and put a mugshot on the newspaper. Much harder to send somebody to the local city council meeting and explain what's going on. So that transfer over the past few years has combined to create, I think, a situation now that is one very concerning. It also has contributed to distrust in media, and it made us ripe for what we're starting to understand came last year. As information about the specifically Russian targeting of Americans starts to emerge, Russian targeting of Americans via troll farms on social media, what continues to strike me is that it's not so much that our technology was hacked, it's that we ourselves were hacked. It's almost the modern equivalent of disease warfare, because our own vulnerabilities, fears, base instincts, terrible history was exploited to sow division and social unrest. We didn't have the antibodies to fight that because of what I've just discussed, the decline of civic education, the decline of local media, the lack of connection and trust with each other. So we were prime targets for this. I'm not one who believes that Facebook and Twitter and Google should have had the national security chops to understand 50 years of Russian active measure history and anticipated that they were being used for state-led propaganda efforts. I actually wonder where the national security apparatus was in these cases. I think there should have been much more of an alarm sounded that these platforms were being used for this kind of manipulation. But now that we're finding out what's happened, I do think that we're about to see greater action, greater involvement at the political level because of its great import and the way in which we were attacked. So that's where we are today. That's the first 20% of the 20th century. Like I said, I feel like we're laying in the floor with all of our Legos spread out everywhere. But when you think about the rest of this century, there are a lot of folks, and a lot of folks here, who are working on some much brighter, more exciting things to come, whether it's gene editing and the ability to fundamentally impact our health and agriculture and prevent disease, whether it's artificial intelligence or automated autonomous vehicles, drones, and all of the exciting things that are potentially coming in the 21st century. Really smart people are working on those things. Very few people are working on how we actually govern when those things are a part of our reality. And that's one of the questions that continues to come back for me, because I think so much about our experience over the past 10 and 15 years with the unintended consequences of tech. And I think about how we're preparing our political system to deal with what's coming. We have some really smart people warning us that these questions need to start now. Elon Musk obviously has been sounding the alarm on artificial intelligence. I think others are raising big questions about other forms of technology that are coming. When I think about policy in this century, I think about the trolley problem that I know you've all heard. So just to recap, the trolley problem is you are sitting at the switch and a trolley's coming, and on one side you have 5 people tied up on the track, and on the other side there's one person standing there, and the trolley is headed for the 5 people. Do you pull the switch and send it over to just kill the one person? And then they throw in all kinds of complications, like, okay, say the one person was a really bad person, or say the one, and it gets really complicated. But of course, the reason to bring that up now is because those people who are working on autonomous vehicles are actually dealing with a real-life trolley question. They have to bake the answer to that question into the software. And that's not just an issue that's going to come up with autonomous vehicles. That's an issue that's going to come up across the policy spectrum as we get to more and more self-executing legislation, regulations, and data-driven governing. And the question is, how are we going to deal with that? There are so many ethical questions to come, and we're not right now proving ourselves even very well equipped to deal with the basic day-to-day questions of just governing, keeping the government open, and dealing with basic legislation. I recently heard someone say that we're right now need to do philosophy on a deadline. And I think that that's very true. How will we govern when we know in advance what the outcome of the policy will be? How will we govern when we know that the laws are going to be carried out and potentially carried out equally? When contracts are self-executing in the blockchain, when the traffic rules are baked into the software of autonomous vehicles, etc. Now, some people are starting to work on evidence-based policy. I know that many folks here have been thinking about that. I got really excited about this concept when I moved from Washington to the Valley and started to experience a bit of the tech culture of even just imagining that you don't come into a meeting saying, I think that the button should be blue or I think that the button should be red. You sit down and you put the button on the website and see whether people click the blue one or they click the red one, and then the data tells you which one is the most appropriate. The idea that that kind of data-driven decision-making could come into our politics is both exciting and concerning, as many have acknowledged. But there's an opportunity for the political discussion to move up the chain from the implementation level of how we do this or that to the goal level of what we actually want to accomplish. These will be the big questions of what we actually want our policy to do. So right now, as we sit at the end of 2017, I think that we are very much in a place where the old system itself is broken. I don't mean the fundamental basis of our laws. I think we've got pretty good source code in the Constitution. But the way that we are implementing and executing policy right now is breaking down. It's almost like we're in the interregnum. The old system doesn't work, and a new system hasn't emerged yet. But I think it's time to start talking about what that should look like. We have, at this point in history, more tools, more data, more ability to know what the truth is than ever before in human history. And yet we're talking about living in a post-truth society, which is crazy. Those tools right now are being used to manipulate, to market, to change perception, and not just in the commercial realm, but also in the political realm. That's madness. It's the pollution of our information age. And I think it will start to be realized as such. I think we're going to look back in disbelief at the first few decades of the 21st century when we think that it's possible that we could even be discussing whether something did or didn't happen, that we can allow misstated facts to stand and go unchallenged within our political system. I think that the time is coming when there will be much more objectivity in the base facts of our policymaking system, which allows us to focus on the more subjective questions of where we want to go. So that sounds very hopeful, and I know it's a bit tough to imagine this beautiful world ahead as we sit where we are. How do we get there? I think that that some of the steps that we have to take to make this reality are to address a few of the pieces that I mentioned earlier. The long road of improving education, specifically education, civic education, can feel almost a little bit daunting because it is such a big task to take on. But I think it is absolutely fundamentally important and something that we have to direct our attention to. The second is the quality of the data and information that we have available for the public. And I think in order to address this, we have to look at where the resources have been removed from that information stream. And I do think that the companies like Google and Facebook and others do have a responsibility to make resources available for quality information. And the third is allowing the public and helping the public understand more the big questions that are coming. So whether it is future of work issues or artificial intelligence or autonomous driving, none of these things need to be surprises to the general public. I come from a small town in Tennessee, and it's been really important for me to realize how different the conversations are out here than they are when I go home, and how that has to change. Because if our society is going to experience massive shift, everyone needs to feel like they're a part of planning for that, and that they're asked about the big questions that are coming. So what we're doing at PopVox to address some of these things. I'm happy to share that we will actually be setting aside one part of the site for a platform called Big Questions. We're going to make information available in about 4-month increments, featuring one big question at a time, to allow the public to come and find out more information. We're going to start with CRISPR, working with the Innovative Genomics Institute here at Berkeley, to present information, allow people to understand some of the issues, and share their own input, ask their own questions, and feel that they are invited to be a part of this large conversation. And then we'll move next to artificial intelligence, and we'll move next to some of the other questions that are coming up. It's important both that the public is given an opportunity to be a part of this, and then that lawmakers and scientists and others have an opportunity to hear those concerns and questions that are coming up. The second piece that we're working on at PopVox is tools for legislative staff. So this is our baby contribution to what we think is an enormously important shift to provide more data and tools for governing for those who are actually working within government, to be able to automate the kind of day-to-day tasks so they can spend more time on policy and more time actually responding to the big challenges that they face. And we're building tools for educators. So we're hoping very soon to announce a project with a major public school system to help students, almost like a stock market game, follow bills that are making their way through Congress and kind of learn about the bills as they're going through the system and make their case to their fellow students and vote on the bills, et cetera. These are all very small pieces, but I think that working with the larger community and having an agreement that we as technologists, as civic people, as academics and others have our part to play in getting ready for what comes next this century, we can look at a bit wider view than the chaos of the moment and work together to make it one that we're proud of. So that's my talk. I would love to have some questions and more of a discussion because I think there's a lot to be learned from the folks in this room.
Somehow I cannot quite share your optimism about big data. Because, you know, big data certainly gives a lot of information, but you can also, depending what selective data you use to make a conclusion, come to exactly opposite conclusion. And even though there may be some people that have some kind of a notion of objective truth, it's not clear that they will reveal that objective truth. They will reveal whatever it is that furthers their goal. Now, one of the key problems I see in our current democracy is that we have this rigid two-party system. And the main goal of every party is to destroy the other party, even if the country as a whole is the collateral that goes to the dogs. So unless we have the right kind of goals, then all this data will not help. It may actually even hurt. And you're looking for the big questions. Let's take healthcare. For me, the big question is, there are probably 25% at the lower echelon of the economic scale that simply cannot pay what it takes for their own healthcare. Somewhere that money has to be raised to pay for that. We can do it with taxes, we can do it with bigger premiums in healthcare, we can do it by letting them go to the emergency center and pay 10 times as much. Nobody in the discussion about Obamacare and taking down has ever openly asked that little question and come up with a real answer. So how do we get people to really focus on this fundamental kind of issue? How do you get rid of the two-party system? How do we pay for healthcare for the poor?
Those are good questions. I don't know that I have the answer to any of them. One thing I would say on healthcare is, and I think this comes up in some of the discussions, but I think that it provides in healthcare, I don't know that we've ever worked backwards from an agreement as a society of what is healthcare and what is, I mean, I know there's some discussion, is it a right? Is it, you know, almost the only healthcare principle enshrined in policy is that if someone gets really sick, they still have the opportunity to be served in an emergency room to save them. And that is almost the only baseline in healthcare that we as a society have agreed to in a way that is actually enshrined in policy. And I agree with you that it's the minutia of how you do things that get kind of that become complicated. I think there's an opportunity to start at some point in this beautiful future with more of an understanding of what the big goals are that we as a society agree on. And then there may be 25 or 250 or 2,500 ways to get to those goals, and we can actually see all of them attempted and know as they're attempted which works better. But I don't think we're there yet by any means.
And I actually have two quick questions. I took the privilege of grabbing the microphone first so I could ask them. My first question is, on PopVox, how will you ensure that there's a diversity of viewpoints present when you're debating these big ideas, making sure that it's inclusive of all socioeconomic strata? And then my second question is, how do we balance out the two polar sides of the arguments around the impact of technology on society? Technology has always had negative and positive effects, and I feel like the discussion now, especially in the realm of AI, is a completely dystopian view. But there are benefits to AI in augmenting labor in the way that we live in our cities and towns. Those are my two questions.
I have so many for you too. So on the question of PopVox, that is a really tough one, the question of diversity of viewpoints. And it's one that we almost have never attempted to say that we're trying to solve, because it's, I mean, we want to create the platform and then hopefully work with partners and make it available for anyone to use. But it is just the eternal question that I don't think anyone has yet solved in the digital space about how to ensure diversity of viewpoints on any platform. We will keep trying. We always emphasize on PopVox that the participants there are self-selected. It is the opposite of a poll. It's the opposite of if you went to try to find 1,000 neutral people and ask them the same question and had some statistically valid answer. It's self-selected people who care enough to find their way there and share their input. But that in itself is an interesting data point. Who cares enough to make their way here and share their information on this, share their viewpoint on this issue? For me as a staffer, the reason it was set up that way was this was who Congress was already hearing from. Wouldn't it be great if there was some transparency into what Congress is already hearing? So I think there's a net positive to that, but I think there would be a lot more value in what you're suggesting, which is an actual ability to reach a wide swath of people and allow them to participate. I'm hoping that these kinds of efforts of reaching out to schools and others or working with other organizations help with that. But if anybody has an idea about how to solve that, it's a constant quest and one that we will very gladly work with anybody to try to improve. I don't know that we ever get to having done enough on that question. And then on AI, I share your optimism. What I think is so important about AI now is that what we bake into the systems that are being built now is who we are and who's sitting at the table and the perspectives that they bring. And I think that it's so important that we make sure that those tables are diverse and that we make sure that we are aspiring to our highest ideals as we're thinking about what the goals are that we're setting for the AIs that are being built. I actually think that at some point in this century, we are going to be asking the same questions that they were asking at the founding of, what is the best and the highest ideals that we can bring to the table right now. Who are we? I mean, I think, things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I mean, how beautiful that they actually distilled it down to such clear goals. But I think we will be called to have a similar kind of clarity as we're building these new systems. And that's what I'm concerned that we're thinking about and up to the task on. I share your optimism.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is that I think one of the biggest challenges in regard to what you're talking about is the echo chambers that we have. It's hard to imagine how to get truth out, as you were talking about, when people are only going to places that confirm their pre-existing beliefs. If you go to Fox News versus MSNBC, it's like you're listening to news from two different planets, and I'm not sure how you break out of that. That's the question I have, a little bit different, is there's a book out by E.J. Dayan, I believe, and others, in which he argues that we have a democracy now that's a democracy of the minority rather than the majority. And he points to the fact that the things like the presidency in 2 recent elections was given to people who got a minority of the popular vote. He talks about how 70%, I think, of the population now lives in only 15 states, and so you can have a Senate in which the majority of senators represent only a small proportion of the population. I was in a discussion of that with somebody, and he took, devil's advocate or not, I don't know, he took the opposite position and said, well, that's just what in the Constitution, that the Constitution was constructed so that smaller population states wouldn't be overrun by large population states, and that we have a republic instead of a democracy where we elect representatives and so on. And so I guess my question is, how do you see that? Should we be looking to make major changes so that minority populations don't vote for president, or should we just say that's the way the Constitution intended it to be?
It's a great question. I'm asking myself these same questions. I don't have the answer. I agree that it was a compromise that, it was the way that the Constitution got ratified, was to have that compromise. If you were to undertake a similar exercise today, it's quite possible that in order to get the votes for ratification, a similar compromise would have to be made. So I think there's always a balance between the ideal and what can be enacted legally. On the question of bifurcation of facts and filter bubbles and things like that, I agree. There's a lot of point of view, right now. I think a lot of point of view and limited fact. I get frustrated on both sides that there's so much commentary in the media. I mean, there's so many times that there's actually something going on, and I'd like to just go see Dan Rather telling me what happened rather than 5 people exactly, you know, rather than 5 people discussing their opinion of what happened and the paid position that they're there to defend. And I just keep thinking, surely somebody's going to start a network like that. I can't be the only one. There's got to be some money in it somewhere. Yeah, it's definitely refreshing sometimes to switch over, and PBS is still a haven for that I agree with.
So, so I have a comment, and I'll try to summarize the question after that. I think it's almost presumptuous for us to think that this is the first time that you're facing a technology that is going to have cataclysmic impact, right? The steam, electrification, you know, communications, radio, TV, right, computing, the internet, all of this had cataclysmic impact. And we have learned, you know, as people, what it means, right? One of the simpler rules that emerges is that we tend to overestimate the impact of these things in the short term and underestimate it in the long term. And you can see the same pattern emerging, let's say, around AI. There is quite a bit of noise of opinions of all the horrible or beautiful things AI is going to do that are confusing the picture, because many of these things are not supported by technology. And there is a little bit of you know, blank of what is going to really happen 15, 20 years from now when the real impact is going to kick in. So here's my question. If we are to impact policy, and policy has a time constant of 4 to 6 years, and what the things that matter is going to emerge 20 years from now, how do we do it?
Well, so this is where I am hopeful about data and evidence-driven policy. So there have been some bipartisan positive efforts over the past 10 years to have more standardized data within government that then can be modeled in ways that can provide greater transparency and understanding of even what's happening from one agency to the other, because we didn't have that ability before. So the Data Act, which was a Republican bill supported by Obama that's been implemented over the past 2 to 3 years, I think actually provides a great amount of hope that at least we can start to have better data from which to draw conclusions. I know I sound like I think it's a panacea, and I don't, but I think that it's a positive step for having more of a long-range vision and having policy decisions that outlive and transcend a 2-year, 4-year, or 8-year cycle, or 6-year cycle. I saw, I think today, that the Chinese leader just put out their 30-year plan. I know that there's always been a discussion about central planning and how that's not a U.S. Thing, but planning is not bad. And to have a vision and to be able to check the data and see if it's getting us there, I think is something that at least begins to hold policymakers, regardless of party, to the same standard. That's not just what did the Dow do today.
So question over here. Things like
Here you are.
yeah, hi. Bodie McBoatface and Microsoft's Twitter bot that was, got taught to be racist. Those are just 2 examples of online tools being susceptible to abuse. And that's before we even look at armies of Russian hackers. So I'm curious, for a tool like VoxPop, how do you make sure that local politics stay local? How can you really identify people's identities and make sure that local politics isn't being corrupted by these outside forces?
Well, so I mean, PopVox started at the federal level and now is available at the state level. We aspire to local, but that will take a while. When we first started, we were hyper paranoid about fake identities and things like that, and soon realized that the larger problem was actually having more people have access rather than worrying too much about the manipulation, because PopVox is a little different than other social media. People are not interacting with each other. They're just there to write to their lawmaker. And so, yes, you can go and, you know, if you wanted to get really creative and you really wanted to send a message to Nancy Pelosi, but you didn't happen to be in her district, you could probably go figure out a way to create a profile and send her a message. But it's very different. It's not like you're trolling Nancy Pelosi's constituents, and it's not a back and forth. It really is just sending a message to your lawmaker. What's interesting is that we've had a few incidents of abuse. I mean, whether it's profanity, only one threat has ever come through in 7 years of PopVox, and we still sent it to the congressional office. We sent it and said, hey, you guys are much better able to deal with this than we are. Please contact the Capitol Police, but, you know, just wanted to make sure you see this and it's coming through. But it's just a different kind of platform. But we obviously can't prevent every type of abuse. It's a little bit different than other platforms, though, because people are not interacting with each other. It's not set up so that someone who really wants to diminish your voice could terrorize you and make you not want to be there, which I think is what's so concerning in other places sometimes. This is, you know, for better or worse, the members of Congress have tough skins. They get a lot of, you know, in some cases, someone being unreasonable, if it's transparent, is actually making the case for the person who opposes them. There's the dynamics are a little bit different than in other places, but it's, you know, it's constant to try to figure out if you know, if terms of service are violated or if there's anything weird going on.
So, Marci, I appreciate you have this optimistic view of the impact that data is going to have on policy making, but I confess I'm a little more skeptical about that, you know, at least in the current circumstances. And I wonder, in your view, over your, you know, career in observing, both from the inside and from a little bit farther outside the legislative process, if you want to comment on how receptive policymakers and their staffs are now to science and technology and data versus other kinds of input from sponsors, constituents, other interests.
Well, I mean, I think, unfortunately, right now, I don't think there are a lot of mechanisms for them to even receive data in a way that's presented in a nonpartisan way. I mean, the resources now for getting information to Congress and to congressional staff are mostly through either advocacy groups or think tanks or others that are, you know, funded in some way by someone with an interest. That's not always bad. I mean, sometimes someone with an interest really just wants to get good information to Congress, but our system is set up that way. We've depleted the other resources that exist within the legislative branch, especially, to provide nonpartisan information to Congress. I would like to see that changed, and I would like to see a lot more resources both within the executive and within the legislative branch given to just pure data. I mean, one of the best resources that Congress has is the Congressional Budget Office, which has been under attack over the past year severely. The Congressional Research Service, in my opinion, is pretty much the greatest thing that exists, and they've had their staff and their budgets continually cut. But I think there's actually a working group with New America Foundation and R Street and a few others called the Legislative Capacity Working Group that's working on how do you provide better tools for lawmakers and policymakers to be able to be less dependent on the advocacy groups and the others with interest on the outside, to be able to go and get independent information themselves. I think there's a desire. I really do. I mean, it's tough when you're on the receiving end of all of this incoming information. You have absolutely no way to counter it. You have no like single source of truth to go to counter the points that are coming at you. And I remember being on that side and thinking, you know, I'm getting all of these meetings and all of these one-pagers and all of these reports saying X. if X weren't true, somebody would be here telling me. You know, it's not like I'm going to go find, because, you know, me as a congressional staffer, I don't have the time or the resources and the knowledge to go investigate all the other potential data points. So, I mean, I think it's less a question of receptivity and more a question of resources, quite frankly. But I do agree that right now the incentives are set up to just take whoever's got the most resources and banging the drum the loudest and probably, you know, ginning up constituents the most. It's a well-worn list of what you need to do to get attention and have your proposal accepted, for sure.
Maybe one last question.
I'm coming from the point that the system is broken, and therefore we need another way to educate people into making decisions. And the only solution I see is that people have to do it locally, and they have to have the skin in the game, and therefore they have to be doing it through cooperative organizations. And then if our cooperative organizations get a big enough network, they essentially force the existing political system to come over to something better. Now, the role the internet can play in that is, in fact, getting the information out to people, because our cooperative organization system is not very strong at this point in our culture. One thing I'd like to point out is, when you came in, you talked about the Russians hacking this election. Now, of course, that's a highly contested point. There's a lot of people saying, no, essentially the accusation is false, or the Russians are doing a minuscule bit of what the US is doing, its color revolutions, and it didn't affect statistically it didn't affect the election anyway. But what really happened was that the people have been told, you've got to vote for the less of the two evils. Eventually people are going to stay home when you do that. That's their only remedy. And so about 10 million Democrats chose to stay home this time. And I went up to campus after the election and said, hey, now you have an opportunity to talk to people you don't normally talk to. That lasted maybe a day. And then it just completely polarized. And so it's at this point, people, you know, just backed off and say, no, it's completely polarized, and there's no chance of making a change there. So, I mean, I'm putting my power behind cooperatives, building that system. Though actually I like better input for lobbying, because given what I'm saying, the little power one has is much better spent lobbying than actually voting, because there's a lot fewer people doing it.
I mean, I think obviously the impact of one vote depends on the district sometimes, to your point, and then also if the efforts of education are local, they're going to be colored by the by those local communities, for sure. Yeah, it's, I mean, I on the point of Russians, I wasn't saying Russians hacked voting machines. I'm talking about the evidence that they created misinformation campaigns, especially the most recent ones that I think are stunning are the ads and campaigns and fake accounts that were created to exploit divisions within our society. I think it's really stunning.
I grew up in McCarthy. My immediate reaction is blame the Russians. I've heard this one before.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for attending and staying for the discussion, and I imagine Marci might have a little bit of time afterward to continue discussions, but thank you. We'll see you next time.